Hello, my friends. Today, Joel is talking to Tom, author of the books Artificial Intelligence Basics and the Robotic Process Automation Handbook. And they discuss what will happen when jobs are automated away at massive scale and why many advanced professions may not be safe from automation. All of this right here, right now, on the Modern CTO Podcast.
This is the Modern CTO Podcast.
What is your backstory? Like, why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah. The irony here is that we have pretty much almost exact backgrounds, except I'm a little older than you, probably a lot older than you. But my similar. But my dad was not an engineer. He was. But he was really into technology just as a passion. So he read a lot of science fiction and just loved technology. So, and this was back in the early 80s. So he bought a computer. I didn't even know he was going to buy me a computer. He bought me a computer and just put it on my desk and then just walked out of my room. And that was his way of saying, you figure it out. So I looked at it for a couple of days, just staring at it, think, what should I do? And so I just started using it and kind of like started simple, learning the basic, no one really talks about the basic computer language anymore. I learned the basic computer language, started creating my own programs. And then from there, learned Pascal. That was a really popular language back in the 80s. And then C. This is before internet. So the way I made money is there were computer magazines that would have the code in the magazines itself, printed in the pages. So I would write programs and publish them in these magazines and make money that way in high school, just like you made money in high school. And then when I got into college, I was never really good at taking exams. So I thought about but I saw students come in the classroom with computers. And I thought, well, probably a lot of other students are not good at exams. So maybe I can create software to help them take and be better at exams. And so that's what I did. When Windows came out, I developed Windows software for that. Ironically, one of the first exams I developed for my software for was for the real estate exam. So people in the real estate industry could get licensed quicker and then get that process going so they could make money faster. Then that company evolved into, the internet came around and that company evolved. And I started another company that was kind of like a Shopify for 1997, where you can build your own website and do some fun things on it. And we sold that to a company called InfoSpace and kind of rode the wave for the rest of the 90s. But along the way, I continued my writing, and I started writing for Forbes.com and different other publications. And so I was kind of always, talking to a lot, just like you, talking to a lot of interesting people. We didn't have podcasts in those days, but we had I wrote for the online portion of Forbes, and in those days, no one even wanted to talk to me because they thought the magazine was better. And but I still got to talk to a lot of interesting people. And so the way I've written different books over the years. Probably the one that's I'm most associated with is the AI Basics book, and that came about. A lot of it had to do with Forbes.com because I was talking to a lot of founders, and AI just kept coming up over and over again. And I thought, there's probably a lot of people that want to know what this is about, but they don't have a technical background. So my idea was to write a book where you can learn about deep learning, but not have to, download TensorFlow and, have an engineering background to know what it's all about. So that's kind of long-winded way of saying, I kind of started off self-taught like you, different startups, but I did some writing along the way and education along the way, and came on this idea for the AI book. And AI has always been very interesting, to me. Back when I started creating my computer programs in the 80s, that there was a lot of movies about AI, and I thought it was really cool, but there was no way I could. In those days, they didn't have TensorFlow or open source or any of those types of things where you could, or even data that you could create these models. So it really wasn't practical. So that's why I focused on these other areas, like the exam prep, internet, and those types of things.
What other books have you written?
Another book on robotic process automation, or RPA, It's a technology that automates the user interface, say ERP systems or CRM systems. The irony here is that companies have spent so much money on technology, and they create their own workflows that can just bog down and get repetitive. So, you go into a typical company and there's always employees doing cut and paste all day long, or, taking a look at a PDF and, doing a couple functions on it, but the same functions over and over again. RPA is you can create these bots that can automate, kind of like macros that can automate those processes. A lot of people confuse this with AI. It really isn't AI, but companies like UiPath and Automation Anywhere, the leaders, have been able to leverage data to identify these processes that are not as optimal and provide suggestions of better processes, and can create bots for you. You don't have to create your own bots. Yeah. So there's a lot of innovation occurring. It's one of the fastest growing areas in enterprise software, especially in the last 2 years with COVID. Companies have had little choice but to automate these systems because they had these huge spikes in activity. And so they just couldn't hire people fast enough to handle the volume. So they started relying on this RPA technology. And UiPath is the leader in this space. So my book on RPA goes through the industry, what the technology can do, how to build a bot, how to implement, how to manage, and things of that sort. So that's
nice.
Another book. Yeah.
So for your AI book, what is the audience like? Just the average person or investor, or who?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, I would talk to investors, VCs, and a lot of times I listened to them and they weren't quite right about certain things about AI themselves, and or even founders of companies. There's probably 1 million AI companies out there because 999,000 of them, just claim they're AI and they're really not AI. And
that's how you get more money.
Exactly. You got to pitch it. I used to be in the trenches where I had to pitch my ventures, and you got to tell them what they want to hear. And even if you don't have it, are they really going to know? So, you got to fake it till you make it. So there's a lot of that. So I see a lot of that. So yeah, it could be for a founder. It can just be for someone who works at a technology company, is curious, PR person, could be someone at HR, they're evaluating software for their, to handle the onboarding and talent management. There's some really tricky issues with that, with privacy and things that can go wrong, and, discrimination and things of that sort. So, you don't expect your HR person to have a data science background and things of that sort. But, with this book, at least they get the general understanding of what this technology can do, some of the risk factors, some of the things to anticipate, how to implement this technology, or how not to spend a lot of money on something that's not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah. And I read the book. It does a great job. It's like, just to cover a couple of things, you've got data, machine learning, deep learning, a little bit, one chapter on RPA, natural language processing, robots, implementation, all those things. So when I was looking at the book, I was like, oh, I know about all this stuff. I wonder what this book's going to be like. Is this going to be a boring book? Is it going to be interesting? And then I was thinking about like how it would bring value to the audience, right? Because we're mostly CTOs, VP of engineering, next generation tech managers and leaders. And one of the things I came up with was it's really good because it provides you, like, the way you succinctly describe and explain things is better than the explanation I have in my head to give to a non-technical person. So it's like education for me on like, if you want to explain it to someone who's new at it, use Tom's words.
Yeah. Well, I've been at it for 30 years of writing, taking technical topics and making them understandable, to those people that don't have that background, so, I was doing that in high school with these computer programs, and, doing it while I was in college with Forbes and things like that. So a lot of experience of that, and just trying to be in the shoes, because, sometimes you really know that you want to just throw a lot of lot of information out there, and and that's usually not the best approach. With this book, are you going to learn everything about deep learning? Absolutely not. Just scratching the surface. But you know what? It's actually just helpful to know what the difference is between machine learning and deep learning is, because I read a lot of articles and it's pretty clear a lot of people don't understand what that the difference is. So
can you tell me what that difference is?
Yeah. So think you look at circles. I use the circles analogy. So artificial intelligence is the circle, the biggest circle. It encompasses everything that has to do with a machine acting like a human, with intelligence, taking data and coming up with insights. So I mean, Siri is obviously kind of artificial intelligence. It takes in data, it takes in words, it analyzes those words, and it parrots back something, an answer for you, right? So yeah, it's a pretty basic idea. So that's the big circle's AI. There's another circle called machine learning, and machine learning is more about using traditional statistics to come up with conclusions. So if you went to, in high school, regression analysis, where you would look at a couple of variables and find the correlations of those variables and what kind of outcomes. So, if you have a certain number of bedrooms and a swimming pool, well, you live in this neighborhood, your house will be worth roughly this amount of money. That's a regression. That's machine learning. So then what is deep learning? Well, deep learning is a circle within the machine learning. It's a smaller part of machine learning. So it's a circle there. And what it's very similar. It takes in data, it analyzes that data and comes up with a conclusion. The thing is, it's way much more sophisticated. So you'll have these things like hidden layers. There'll be a lot of these hidden layers. And it's taking in this information and going through these hidden layers and allocating certain weights to this data. And then it tests it and seeing, is that accurate or not? If it's not accurate, it'll then go right back to where it began and then try again and find, and it's just going through that and just crunch. And these models are just huge. I mean, Microsoft has these models that are like 100 billion parameters that just crunch numbers as deep learning. So it's just so much more sophisticated in terms of the analysis. So in a way they're similar, but it's more of a difference in the huge degree and differences in terms of the amounts of data that's being processed and how it's being processed. And then there you'll hear things like back propagation and all these different really complicated concepts. And you don't have that machine learning. Again, machine learning, a lot of times, kind of what you learned in high school. It's more sophisticated, obviously more sophisticated, but it's basic statistics. Machine learning just goes to a whole nother level of analysis. And that's where you need these hugely sophisticated, GPUs, these sophisticated hardware systems that can process just a large amount of information. Humans can't do it. And a lot of times it comes up with patterns that humans would never even think of. And that's where the real power comes from this AI. I mean, it tells you something you never, it comes up with conclusions that, you couldn't figure out. So it could be something like you have a oil rig and it'll tell you, a certain part is going to fail within the next week. It may be a $50 part, but if your rig fails because of a $50 part and it fails for like 20 minutes, or you have to take a helicopter and that costs you 30 grand to get a helicopter to get that $50 part, bring it back on the rig, that's a big deal. So those kinds of deep learning systems can be hugely beneficial to companies. And that's where in the last 10 years, we've seen so much of the innovation in AI is in deep learning. And we've had that because we have the GPUs, cloud computing, access to data, and then also all these sophisticated theoretical concepts that have come from these geniuses like Geoffrey Hinton and all these brilliant people from Facebook or Google who've come up with a lot of the theoretical analysis for that. So the last 10 years has been really a new age for AI, and largely that has been due to deep learning.
And so when When are they going to take all of our jobs?
Yeah, I got a really deep discussion about this with well, actually, my first in-person presentation was 2 weeks ago. And I did a presentation on AI, and I brought this topic up, and we had a really deep conversation. I, you talk to companies, and they'll say, "Oh, AI is not going to take jobs. It's going to enhance our jobs. It's going to make our jobs better, or it's going to take it's going to take things that we do. It's repetitive and tedious, and we don't want to deal with that. We humans want to do sophisticated things." The problem is, this AI is going to do more and more human judgment type abilities. I mean, driving a car is, that takes a lot of intelligence. I mean, that's not something that's, tedious. I mean, that's takes some skill to do that. You know, so I think that the next 10 years, right now we have a labor shortage, but I think in 10 years, I think there will be some professions that will be automated away. I mean, I think like a CPA, even an attorney, I mean, I talked to the CEO at Automation Anywhere, and I mean, he told me like in 5 or 6 years, he thinks that, the AI will be sophisticated enough to understand any contract, you know. So, I do think that, and then the thing is that, people say that, well, if it gets automated away, new opportunities will come up, but how do we know that's going to happen? So I think we're in for some interesting changes, and your career path may be radically changed because of AI, maybe within the next decade or so, because of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I fully agree, but that's been happening since the beginning of time, right? The jobs we have today are not the jobs that we had 1,000 years ago. So I like both sides of the argument, to be honest with you. I think that's the most fun because I agree with parts on both sides. And when I started to research this, it led me to a man named Ray Dalio. And
yeah, sure.
He talks
Bridgewater Capital.
Yeah, he was the one that taught me about how the economy works and gave me a real good mental image of how things work. And so I was trying to sort of, reconcile these two ideas of, okay, let's say that we automate everything. Like we automate everything, even all the human stuff. Like there's machines making music and stuff. Well, the way that currency works is it's an exchange between humans for agreed upon value, right? So like we're not trading money with chipmunks. They don't care about our dollars, right? So we're exchanging things of value with each other, and that's what the economy essentially is. And so our values change. The things we value changes over time. And I think they'll always change. And so let's say that everything was automated. Well, I don't know what it'll look like exactly, but there will still be people trading things for other things. And even if 99% of all humans are some various form of artist, right? You would want to pay for the authenticity, right? So, and also we always tend to leave out the fact that our population grows and will become interplanetary and will expand and there's more people to trade with. And so I think there is a lot of pain along the way. I think we're more connected than ever and people now can talk about that pain and it's more clear that it's going to happen. And there's actually things we could try to do about it. So it's definitely taking a lot of our attention, but I am an optimist long term. I think it'll all work out, but yeah, there's going to be a lot of people displaced along the way.
Yeah. And, I think that's, retraining, reskilling are very important. We've seen that already with IT, with the huge shortage in qualified developers and coders. I mean, you've seen the emergence of these online platforms, these schools, these boot camps and stuff, to get people, trained for that. So I think that's an important part of that. If we can get better at retraining people, but yeah, change is always not fun for a lot of people. Yeah. For the entrepreneurs, disrupting the industry, it's fun. But if you're the one being disrupted, it's really not a fun place to be.
Yeah. Oh, tell me. My father-in-law is about to retire. For 30 years, he's driven like semi trucks for UPS, right? And I've been with my wife for about 8 years now, and every year I was giving him updates on the automation of the semi truck industry. And he was telling me the whole time, it's like not possible. It's not possible. There's so much to it. It's very it is a hard test. Because you wrote in the real estate test, the trucking test is actually a very difficult test. Yeah, it's right up there with like real estate's really tough. Insurance is tough, trucking stuff. But I was, every holiday meal, we're sitting down and I'm just showing him the updates until like, I think 2 years ago, they actually made the first delivery with an autonomous semi truck. And he is like, it's not possible. I'm like, well, dude, they did it. Here's a video of it happening. And, one of the things that made me think about was like, there's this, in different industries and different jobs, there's this weird undercurrent that we don't have as much of in technology. So in technology, I'm self-taught, right? So we understand that like, okay, there's a new language, there's a new framework, there's a new style. I've got to learn these different skills. We have to, things change, new technology comes out, we have to learn new things. But for somebody who's been driving a semi truck, I mean, like very little has changed in the semi trucks. Like you get really small changes over time. You might get like a new brake system this year and a new navigation system. So they're like these really small changes, not requiring them to like, unload huge amounts of mental effort. So there's this feeling in a lot of industries that like, I should just have to learn how to do my one job and I should have this right to like do that job forever. And so I've been trying to better understand that, because that's contrary to how the free market works, like, or how humans progress, even in non-free markets, how humans progress. That's just not how it works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think
that
is?
I think, well, we when you get older, you kind of get set in your way, and then you complain about, or, like you said, it's not going to work. And as you get older, or you get kind of into your own echo chamber, it's hard to change, and it's hard to see things coming at you. So, until it's too late. And even then you're kind of dragging and screaming and saying it hasn't changed. And, but there is so much money being plowed and poured into these technologies. I mean, Amazon is spending huge amounts of money to automate everything. Google's doing the same thing. Microsoft is doing it. It's just only a matter of time. I mean, this can all be replicated. I mean, driving a truck is probably easier than, automating a regular car, except when it comes to there's things where, making those turns and, finding those, getting, backing up the truck and things like that. But it's probably a computer would probably do better at that anyway than a human. So yeah, I mean, and some of these industries like trucking, trucking is millions of jobs. It's a huge industry. Families depend on that. And it could be a very much an overnight thing, because one, wages are going up. So what's popular for automation is, is it a high cost labor? Is it high cost labor? Well, trucking really is. So there's a lot of incentive to replace that, that labor. So if companies have an opportunity to do it, they're going to do it because they can justify the ROI. There's some areas where it's tougher, because I know there's, robots. I've seen robots in, fast food companies and so forth. Now a couple of years ago, it didn't make a lot of sense because the wages were pretty low. But now, it's like $20, $25 an hour to hire, someone at McDonald's. So it's getting to the point where maybe that robot does make a lot of sense to bring in. It's all there. I mean, the technology is all there to flip hamburgers.
And the cost is going down with technology.
And the cost is always going down too. Yeah. So that cost curve is always going down. And then wages usually don't go down. They usually go up. So there's a point where it just makes so much economic sense for these companies to buy this technology. It was always tough because how do I justify it? Am I going to spend $100,000 on this robot? And how long is that going to take? I don't. A lot of times they just don't want to make those upfront expenses, but it's getting to the point where it's starting to make sense to do that, and that's going to drive. It's going to accelerate the change, and it's going to change the world in a big way. And I don't think we've really thought about it.
I think about it a lot. That's why I have this podcast. I was like, I need relationships at scale. I need to know a lot of people. I need to know the smartest people. And then that way it'll position me best for which way it goes. So relationships are vital, man. I was talking with Kyle yesterday. He's not the CTO of Verizon anymore. He's like executive VP of technology innovation. I don't know, some long title, but he's like a real bright guy, was an engineer, and he's super smart. But, we were talking about, the future and technology and all of this stuff. And we didn't really get into automation, but one of the reasons that I was excited to talk with you is that, sometimes when I get to talk with these, more executive people, they won't be able to speak as freely about certain things because they've got PR teams and whatnot, which I understand. But if I were to make you like leader of the free world, how would you even begin to approach like the questions of people saying like, what are we going to do about automation? And
well, first thing is you can't really do anything about it because it's just going to happen. It's happening already. Trying to stop the train is not going to be helpful because companies are going to find a way to do it. And we live in a free market system. So if they want to buy a robot to change, to replace somebody, they're going to do that. If it's cost effective for them to do it, they certainly will do that. And I agree that you mentioned about the PR thing. In my book, I have a story about IBM because in the early days, IBM was investing heavily in AI, and then they emerged this talk in the 50s. Emerged this talk about replacing jobs, and IBM wanted nothing to do about that, so they started backing off. And most of the research in AI in the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s was primarily from government institutions and educational institutions, not companies, because they didn't want to be associated with that because of the bad PR. So if a company tells you, oh yeah, this is, don't worry, well, then you probably should worry. And it's going to start automating jobs and jobs that you don't think would be automated. So we always think it's, again, the flipping of the hamburgers or things like that. But I talked to someone who's pretty smart with technology. And, one thought experiment was if you had a nurse and you had a doctor, which one would be automated first? And we thought that probably the doctor, not the nurse, because there's certain skills that the nurse has that computers probably will have a hard time, bedside manner, just dealing with people and things of that sort. And some people just want to deal with people. And for those kinds of things, they don't want to deal with a doctor. But, a lot of times, what does the doctor do? They ask you questions, they give you tests, and then they prescribe you something. It's pretty much the typical workflow. Now, it's a lot different if, heart surgery, cancer treatments, and all that. But I think for like a general medical, which takes up a lot of our costs anyway, I mean, it's pretty straightforward for medical. And we've already seen this, to some extent with the use of like teledoc, through the COVID. You don't have to go to a doctor's office. There's these ways of remote treatment, things like that. So I would say that, my recommendation would be, let's find ways to retrain people. You have a certain path for them to take. Or different paths for them to take, because I do think that it's very we've grown up in a society that we feel that we have to work because it almost shows it's how we value ourselves. Like we feel valuable if we work, we earn money, support a family, and if you can't do that, and it's really no fault of your own, psychologically, I think it's very damaging. And so now maybe over generations that changes, but for those generations that have grown up that way, it's very difficult. So I think that transition is not easy. So I think it's just trying to find ways to, maybe it's some new deal of automation. I don't know, but there has to be different paths, different education, and things, things like that. But I think there's certain industries that, a lot of it will probably get automated away.
Yeah, and different industries are at different levels. Like when the whole port backing up thing happened, I started researching into that, and there's fully autonomous like ports all over the world. The unions got in the way and said, we're going to make it manual, so we're going to have slow ports. And when I see stuff like that, I'm like, I get it, right? Like let's say I'm 55 or 60 and I'm about to retire and I'm a port worker. Like you don't want to go make that person like learn a whole new skill. Like and so there's definitely human considerations for like the edge cases or the transition points. Like universal basic income is something a lot of people talk about. I don't know a whole lot about it other than they're running a couple tests in some different countries, but it's like some of the things I'm like, those sound like okay solutions as long as they don't violate principles of a free economy. And because you just give everybody money and you'll see runaway inflation. It's crazy.
Well, we've already seen that.
We're seeing it
we've seen it in the last 2 years. Yeah. I mean, we pumped a lot of money and we paid people not to work.
I know.
I mean, and we're now seeing the consequences of that. But there's certain people that prefer probably not to work, and they'd be just as glad to take money and not work. I don't know what that percentage is. I know there's a percentage that believe that or are fine with that. I know there's another percentage that they just love to work. And even if they're not making money, I think they just need to work. So, but an aggregate, if you have a large percentage of the population getting paid not to work, I do think that's a problem.
I think it's also a problem if humans are very impacted by their environment, right? So I'm careful about what's in my environment. You mentioned Jeffrey Hinton earlier. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
What does he do? I haven't heard of him.
Oh, yeah. So he's really interesting background here. So he's grew up in England. I think his great grandfather was Darwin. And his mother told him, if you're not a professor, you're pretty much useless. I mean, not that bad, but pretty much like you have to become a professor. And so he grew up in a very academic family in England. And so he pursued that path for himself of academia. And he got into college probably in the late 60s, early 70s. And his focus was he loved AI. The thing is, there are these, during the last 30, 40 years, there have been these AI winters where AI gets shunned. Everyone doesn't want anything to do with AI anymore because and by the time Hinton got into the university, I don't know if it was Oxford or Cambridge, I forget which one, he came in right when the first AI winter hit. and governments were pulling back funding because of inflation. And they said, who cares? This technology is it's interesting, but it doesn't help us in any way. So he got in at the worst time, and he didn't care. He thought that this technology was the way of the future. And he was in a winter for decades. He was in a wilderness. I mean, no one wanted to. Some of these times, some of these professors would come up with other names for artificial intelligence, just because artificial intelligence had such a bad name because of the AI winters. But he had none of that. I'm totally into AI, and he kept at it. So during the 80s, he came up with this concept of backpropagation, which was a core part of deep learning. And the thing is, deep learning, the origins of deep learning go back to the late 50s. And someone named Frank Rosenblatt, who came up with the core concepts, and it was called the perceptron. And it tried to emulate the neuron of a human brain. And he had the different hidden levels and layers and things like that, but not as sophisticated because he didn't have the sophisticated computers. And then there's another group, this symbolic group Marvin Minsky and the folks at MIT who were totally against the perceptron and thought you could, create these expert systems and do if-then statements and solve the world problems. And Minsky wrote a book that said the perceptron was terrible, and then Frank a few years later died in a boating accident, and the perceptron went away until Hinton took a look at it and said, "No, this is it. This is," and that. So he became really the godfather of deep learning. And it was about 2010 or 2011, 2012 when we started getting these huge data sets, and they started to apply Hinton's theories against these data sets, and the accuracy rates were just off the charts. So the recognition of, it was like cats, cats versus dogs, and it's kind of simple, but the recognition was just so much higher. And then all of a sudden Hinton became the guy in artificial intelligence, but it took him like 30 or 40 years to get there. So he's still around, he's still alive. He cannot sit down because has a major back problem. And I've seen interviews with him, and he never sits down. And he's just a brilliant person. And Google bought his company. He started a little company, and works for Google now.
Do you know him? Do you have a relationship with him?
I've not met him, no.
Okay.
No. But done a lot of research on him. Yeah, if you could interview him, then you should reach out to him.
Yeah,
Fascinating story.
I'll have a standing desk company sponsor the episode.
Exactly.
I want to talk with you about bias in AI, right? And specifically in the AI data, because data is like one of the most important parts, the whole GIGO thing, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So this bias in AI data, you see it kind of emerge publicly as things like, oh, they weren't able to recognize this individual's face on the video because of the skin tone color, right? And other different ways, or people are represented and different groups have different angles on it. But my thought on it is it's like slightly different. Like when we're talking about it, like how can data not be biased? I'm curious to know this. Like how can you have a data set that's not biased?
Well, data reflects our society and our real world. So, and we're a biased species. I mean, we don't like to think we're biased, but we are, and we do discriminate. And we're from time to time not very fair in the way we do things. So the data picks up on that. So in a way, you're just reflecting the real world, but you don't want to have decisions, that you make using data that will result in unfairness and discrimination. So, if someone is going to get a loan, we want to make that as fair as possible. If someone wants to get hired, let's make that fair. We don't want to lock someone out because the data goes against them. So I think that, big move in AI is responsible AI. That we just can't create a model and just let the model make all our decisions, especially in these sensitive areas, about finance, whether to how many years we put a person in prison, there are computer programs that do that. So we got to be very careful with some of these things. And I think companies are being more responsible. And I think that's a good thing. But there are a lot of disaster stories of, and the other thing too, it's not like the data scientist is there plotting, these diabolical
nefarious
plans.
Yeah,
exactly. It could, but you go and look at a room full of data scientists, and they're all white and they're all male and they all went to the same schools. So what do you think? I mean, they're going to take a certain view on the world. So, that's the other thing. I think we have to have more diverse data scientists. We just can't have the same people with the same backgrounds making these decisions and creating these models.
Let's do a shout out for your book. Where should people go buy the book?
Just speaking of the world changing, I don't know if there are bookstores anymore. So the best way to get my book is to go to Amazon, put my name, Tom, last name Taulli. Buy other books like RPA, AI, and so forth. That's the best way to get a copy of my book. And it's both. There's actually a Audible edition to my AI book, and a couple of years ago when I published the book, I had people in Silicon Valley that talked about it, and they go, "Can it be an Audible?" Because they go, "I'm on the planes all the time, in the car, and I just don't have time, to just sit down and read." So there's an Audible version as well.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you found this episode useful, please share it with a friend or a colleague who you think would get value from it. And if you have topics that you would like to hear discussed on the podcast, either add me on LinkedIn or send me an email, joel@moderncto.io. Every time I get an email or LinkedIn message, it absolutely makes my day and inspires me to keep going.